Um, I don't think Dr. Pineda can hear me, but I am sure that you will join me. You will all join me to thank him for his very important contribution, and he highlighted in a very concise way for us how this should happen at all levels. For example, he spoke about how to translate or to ensure that local laws are congruent with the international norms, but also the role of the executive and the governor in ensuring, or like he said, really signaling disability rights, the importance of budget allocation, administrative capacity, and also the measuring public attitude, making sure that people understand the issues, concerns, and are really fully knowledgeable about the concerns and needs of people with disability. And finally, also the participation of people with disability to inform policy and participation in all stages. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Pineda. And as I said, I had the great pleasure to meet him in person at the last time, and he's a very, very impressive speaker. And definitely, disability is not a barrier, and it's not an obstacle for him. And he's really very, truly inspirational. I now have a great pleasure, excuse me, to introduce, let me get this right, Miss Venus Lagan, who is the Secretary General of Rehabilitation International. She is, which is, the initials are RI. She is RI's 9th Secretary General and the first person with a disability to ever occupy the post. Prior to joining RI, she was the immediate past chairperson and first female chair. So, Ms. Lagan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel today. I bring to you warm greetings from my organization, Rehabilitation International. As a person with a disability who loves to enjoy life to the fullest extent possible, just like everyone else, access for me is something indispensable, or even something I can't live without. But having been born and raised in a country where accessibility has been quite a challenge, I had always thought how beautiful the world would have been if people realized that everyone has equal right to the built environment, thus the need to be sensitive to include others. Countless times I thought that being a wheelchair user has limited my options and the opportunity to enjoy and benefit from activities which many others just take for granted. Then came the realization that with disability being a social construct, so are the barriers that limit movement and the opportunity for the enjoyment of the rights of persons with disabilities. Over the years, the struggle for equal rights to opportunities in the context of persons with disabilities has continued until the adoption and subsequent ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 9 years ago. Following ratification by an unprecedented number of countries, we started to see more political will to address our long-standing issues on the challenges we face in accessing and being included in the life of our communities. Access has been and continues to be central and an important determinant on the extent with which we, persons with disabilities, can enjoy our rights on equal basis with others. In the many years that I and my colleagues in the disability community have been involved in the advocacy work for disability rights, we have realized that we do not always achieve our goals using what may be considered as the conventional way of doing things. We have to be open in employing or adopting new strategies to achieve our shared ends. That includes, or that strategy applies to realizing the goal for inclusion of persons with disabilities. But it is worthwhile to note that even with the convention in place, it has never been easy to ask authorities, mayors, or chief executives of towns and cities to invest often limited resources for purposes of providing access to persons with disabilities. In contrast, talking about the potentials of access in the context of travel, leisure, and recreation has proved to be a lot more attractive to chief executives or everyone working in government, for that matter. Asking chief executives of cities to invest in building access features for persons with disabilities is not readily welcomed nor appreciated. To put it simply, this is often a hard sell. In contrast, when we speak about accessible tourism, there is often so much interest and enthusiasm. It's a more welcome topic for discussion. Chief executives often speak proudly on how many tourists have visited their countries, how the revenues derived from this industry has provided jobs to the local population. Their governments intend to invest more resources to bring in more tourists, and their interest to continue exploring possibilities to include tourists who require accessibility, recognizing that this is a growing market that has the potential to bring in more revenues or even promising a handsome return of investment. That observation has led to the recognition of the potential of inclusive and accessible tourism in realizing the goal of inclusion and access for persons with disabilities. After all, accessible tourism addresses the creation of universally designed environments that can support people who may have temporary disabilities, family with young children, and the ever-increasing number of the aging population, just to name a few. As many of you may agree, inclusive tourism brings together everyone who need to be involved in creating accessible environments. These include policy makers, designers and builders, industry professionals, tourists and travel enthusiasts. They all become stakeholders in a collaboration to produce the best possible product, an environment for all, cities for all. It goes without saying that there is synergy that results from the work to create inclusive and accessible environments using universal design, a transformation in attitude, and in the realization that even the most reluctant of travelers with mobility limitation can enjoy travel, leisure, and recreation activities if due consideration is given by the industry for access and inclusion at every step of the way, because travelers with disabilities know exactly how they must supplement what is being offered in terms of services and facilities through their own ingenuity and personal experience and resources. After all, isn't it that persons with disabilities are the experts of their own situation? They definitely can help find solutions to their access challenges. So in this way, they can contribute to breaking the barriers. That's a win-win for all. People working in this field say that the main goal of inclusive tourism as a means to address disability needs is to accommodate the broadest range of people without stigma or the need for special accommodation. It equalizes opportunities to all. It eliminates the need to make a distinction of whether one type of tourists or travelers have different needs and requirements from the others. Inclusive tourism is an example of democratization and the realization of human rights through a market-driven mechanism. In my view, as a person with a disability, the pursuit of accessible tourism opens opportunities in realizing the goal of building inclusive and accessible cities. And it opens possibilities of addressing the access needs of 1 billion persons with disabilities, 15% of the world population, an enormous number of people who cannot be excluded and must not be excluded. In addition, there is the rapid aging of the world's population. The needs of persons with disabilities and elderly people for access to the environment is basically the same, a need that cannot be ignored, one that needs to be addressed now. What does this say to us? The message is simple. In order to realize the goal of access and inclusion, there is the need to approach projects from the outset using universal design, where we design our facilities to include the maximum number of people who can enjoy or benefit from them. As one traveler or travel writer has aptly indicated, rather than just put one special table at a picnic site adapted for a wheelchair, let's make good investment of our limited resources by ensuring that all tables in the picnic site are designed to allow wheelchairs to roll under one end of the tables. It doesn't have to be difficult or a difficult journey. It only involves taking a different approach. Good, fair, responsible behavior should be presented not as a niche, but as a norm. Having said that, let me end my presentation by saying that accessibility is a central element of any responsible and sustainable development policy. It is both a human rights imperative and an exceptional business opportunity that can't be missed and should not be missed if we are to realize the goal of building inclusive and accessible cities. It goes without saying that access does not only benefit persons with disabilities or those with special needs. It benefits us all. Thank you.
Luega, and thank you very much for, in a way, using, all the concept that we have been talking about, and for showing it through inclusive and sustainable tourism and the importance of universal design. Indeed, as you have highlighted, accessibility is a central element of any responsible and sustainable development policy. But also, thank you for highlighting how this is really about benefits to all. It's not just for persons with disability, but in order for us to build truly inclusive and sustainable cities for all and leaving no one behind, we need to ensure accessibility to all, including persons with disability. Again, thank you very much. Our last speakers, last but not least, is Ms. Laurie Ann Girvan. Ms. Ann Laurie Girvan has 25 years of experience in housing, community development, post-disaster and conflict rebuilding, and non-profit management. She has dedicated her career to promoting the empowerment and inclusion of marginalized people in diverse contexts, ranging from remote rural communities in Africa to urban neighborhoods undergoing change in the Americas. Ms. Laurie Ann Girvan, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for inviting Gates to be here. I am the still quite new Executive Director of the Global Alliance on Accessible Technologies and Environments, GATES. GATES' mission is, as a leading international organization, working to advance accessibility through universal design of the sustainable built, social, and virtual environments. What does this mean for who we are and what we do? Well, we are persons with disabilities and allies. We represent a diversity of sectors: academia, social enterprises, for-profits, NGOs, and community organizations. But we are at our heart a network of practitioners, architects, advocates, policy advisors, web designers, transportation specialists, media, basically the same list that Professor Birch spoke to. We're particularly honored and excited to sponsor this year's event because our raison d'etre, our reason for being as an organization, is not only to make the case that inclusion matters, but to equip people with the skills and practices to make inclusion happen. Some of the ways we are doing this are by providing technical expertise to apply accessibility and universal design, and it might be in the smallest context, such as a pocket park, but all the way to thinking about cities. We're developing tools and guidelines, and we're building capacity and exchange amongst our global membership. Our Global Accessibility News reaches 25,000 people, and really the pulse point of the organization are our volunteer country representatives, 40 who are primarily in the Global South. Most recently, some of the work we're doing related to the theme today, we have piloted an accessible online platform to train professionals, architects, landscapers, urban planners in accessibility of public spaces. And our hope is to merge this kind of learning approach with an opportunity to validate accessibility expertise. We're also working actively in the area of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And I think we often focus on our large cities, the New Yorks, the Lagoses of the world, but in northern Canada, our cities and towns such as Whitehorse, Yukon are vital places where people are gathering, and we are working with them to make sure that in the event of disaster, people with disabilities are included. And one of the most exciting aspects of that program is we're actually working with school children on a program, No Friend Left Behind. We are today increasingly recognizing that solving problems and getting to scale on social change requires us to apply approaches such as system planning and design thinking. As you saw from my biography, I am not a specialist in accessibility and universal design. I do come to this work as a builder of affordable housing and as a community development specialist. And I've learned both the positive way and the hard way that planning for inclusion is so important. And if we stick to business as usual, we'll have terrible consequences, including deadly ones. So we must increasingly be thinking about how to work across sectors. And at Gates, we actively work in the areas of transportation, information and communications technology, the built environment. But we too are moving to bring our expertise together to solve problems and have a different type of impact. We are looking at placemaking that supports accessible and inclusive cities and destinations. And we are thinking more about system level work, including through our disability inclusive disaster risk reduction work. The themes of today's event point to a framework of how we must approach making cities inclusive and accessible. We need to continue to be rights-based. Through the convention and other legislation in our countries, we have laid the groundwork for inclusion of persons with disabilities and those most at the margins of our cities by shifting policies and attitudes from a medical model over the years to a very sound human rights vision. But there is, of course, more to do. As I've already noted, we must continue to be systems-based in our vision and practice. And I think both Victor, who we also claim as our own, he's on the board of Gates, and Professor Birch really outlined some of the thinking we need to do around the enabling environment so that we can work in a systems way. We must be evidence-based. 1.3 persons with disabilities is a compelling reminder of the impact that our work can have, but sometimes there is a detrimental effect to what I call big numbers data. We can sometimes get so caught up in the scale and scope of a problem that we aren't able to break it down into action, and we've heard a lot today about the importance of implementation. So we must continue to challenge ourselves around being evidence-based. Inclusion is not the median. We can get maximum benefit through universal design, but we must also think of people most at the margins if we're really going to achieve an inclusive city. Last but not least, we must really continue to challenge ourselves to be humanity-based if we are to achieve SDG Goal 11. And I think a number of our colleagues have spoken to this needing to be a human-centered approach. We're still building our cities using siloed approvals and planning processes. We are valuing big-ticket projects over getting the basics right. I've often been struck in my own work in housing that we can spend millions of dollars for a phenomenal engineering construction feat, cantilevered tunnels and all kinds of things. But then we as developers, and I would include my nonprofit peers in this, plead hardship when a tenant with a disability needs a unit improvement. We focus on narrow infrastructure, the hardware of the city like roads and bridges, but not on broader interaction. And I think I'd like to challenge us to rethink of what infrastructure is. We need an infrastructure of people, housing, community facilities, parks, even our virtual communities that are so vital to breaking down isolation and connecting people for change. We can transact billions of dollars of stock exchanges in milliseconds. That's happening right down the street here. But yet we continue to fail to meet the economic needs and basic information accessibility of persons with disabilities. So clearly, as other speakers have pointed out, we know what we need to do. We just need to have the will and put in place the systems to do it. We've succeeded also, and I really appreciate your comments on accessible tourism, in getting buy-in to the business case for things like accessible tourism, and in my field, around energy savings and the importance of climate change. And of course, over the pond in Paris, our peers are discussing things like carbon taxes and energy savings performance agreements and emission regulations. We need to not lose sight of the business case to improve lives equally alongside things like energy savings and revenues for the government coffers. There are policies and investment tools in these fields, particularly within the context of sustainability and energy, that are exciting opportunities and should be connected to ensuring inclusive cities. All over North America, there are building retrofits happening to ensure energy efficiency, but they are not considering accessibility. Lastly, we are settling for the input of the few rather than the imagination and the engagement of the many. And I am so heartened as a former New Yorker to hear about the commitment to engagement that the Department of Transportation is making. And I also want to commend you on recognizing the importance of getting the basics right, getting our information in accessible formats, really understanding who we're serving, and then using that as a platform to engaging people. It's my hope that Gates, alongside everybody here today, can be part of a better world and part of a new urban agenda where persons with disabilities help drive the vision of making cities sustainable and inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gervin. And I think that you have already a bit also summarized all what has been said, but thank you for introducing the post-conflict and, post-conflict and disaster situation, post-disaster situation, because it's very linked, and in the 2030 agenda, actually, there is a link, a strong link between development and disaster, conflict, peace and security, and I think it's important you brought that element into this discussion. I think we run out of time. We wish to have time for question and answers. Unless you have a very burning question, I think we really run. Daniela, you have the floor.
Yes. It's not a burning question, but it's a burning thank you. Thank you for the morning, what I've heard. By listening to your words, I think that you have given us even more motivation in the division of social policy and development. I want to thank the team in my division that has organized this day, namely the chief of the section on disability that serves also the convention of CRPD, Mrs. Kiko Ito, and Eric, who is sitting there. I don't pronounce your family name, Eric, because I always make a mess. And I would like to thank also the interpreters, because we often speak very, very fast. And for the interpreters of the sign language, we really make their work extremely tough. So I thank them very much. I would like also to thank Venus. But talking about tourism, you gave us a very specific example of what kind of actions can be taken, what real mainstreaming means, And it is something universal, what you brought to the table, tourism for everybody. And it also changes the mindsets of people, so attitudes, etc. And of course, as a former broadcaster on this very specific topic for years, I found it very thrilling, and that's what I try to bring back to the United Nations. And indeed, we already had a couple of fora on this very specific topic, organized one for the Asian Pacific region in Hawaii, and then another one together with the stronger collaboration of the Dominican Republic for the Latin America and the Caribbean region. And I think that what you brought to the table should be really considered as something that gives enthusiasm to everybody. Okay, this was my burning thank you.
And thank you to all. This session is closed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our session. Inclusion Matters, Access and Empowerment to People with Disabilities. Our panel discussion will be taking action for persons with invisible disabilities, mental health and well-being, a new global priority of the SDGs. First of all, let me welcome the panelists who are with me, and Akiko Ito, the focal point on disability. Welcome to this panel. It's been a very long morning, and I would like to ask the panelists to be as brief as possible in order for us to comply with a long past schedule. I would like to also thank the representatives who are here, His Excellencies, and especially the representative of Ecuador. Ladies and gentlemen, persons with mental, intellectual, and psychological disabilities have been long marginalized in global development discourses and even in the disability-related policies in government. In fact, and of course, the Convention on Rights for Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted in 2006, refers to physical, mental, intellectual, and sensory impairments. Thus, persons with mental disabilities and persons with intellectual disabilities are definitely included in the Convention, which is a legally binding tool for those countries that ratified it. At the moment, we have 160 countries who have signed and ratified the Convention. 160 who have ratified. We have some more that have signed it and have not ratified it. Disability is now included in the 5 goals of the SDGs, which was adopted in the UN summit in September. In addition, mental health and well-being got, for the first time, included in 2030 agenda and the SDGs. This gives us an unprecedented opportunities and mandates to all the member states, United Nations entities, CSOs, and all the other governmental development stakeholders to realize universal access and inclusion of persons with intellectual disabilities and persons with mental or psychological disabilities in all societies. Today we have a distinguished world leaders on mental health, well-being, and disability that have gotten together in the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. First, I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of Argentina for supporting this important panel, which sheds light to this much ostracized but crucially important area of priority. The panel discussion is co-organized by the United Nations University, UNU, the United Nations Secretariat of the Conventions of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the University of Tokyo, and the Nippon Foundation. First of all, I would like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Mateo Estrema, Charge d'Affaires of the Permanent Mission of Argentina, who is one of the wonderful global leaders in this area. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gallegos, and I'm really pleased and honored to participate in this panel. And at the outset, I would like to thank you for your words in introducing me, but also I would like to echo your words and commenting the role that Ecuador plays in the agenda of disabilities here at the United Nations. And I can say that you have been a leader on this issue these years, and really the actions that you did during the negotiations of the 2030 Development Agenda are something to be commended. I'm here as a representative of Argentina, as one country that has a strong commitment to this issue and that has always been involved on these issues in order to move the agenda forward at the United Nations. I'm also here as a parent, and I would like to explain why I said that I'm here as a parent. I am the father of a wonderful boy, Mateo, who 10 years ago had been diagnosed with autism, with pervasive development disorder within the autistic spectrum. And so for me, it's not only a matter of professional commitment to be here, to represent my country, and to participate in this panel, and to say a few words, but it's also a personal commitment to the issue of disabilities and the importance that we attach to this issue in promoting the agenda here at the United Nations and elsewhere. I would like to limit my comments to very few aspects on the 2030 development agenda. I know that you had a very long session in the morning, as Ambassador Gallegos mentioned, and many people mentioned and recalled the importance of the document that we adopted 60 days ago. And this document precisely speaks about many of the pressing issues in the international agenda, but one of the issues that I believe that we collectively made an effort to remedy the mistakes of the past was to bring out of the invisibility the issue of disabilities. When we when the MDGs were put forward by the United Nations, the question of disabilities was not included. That was why when we negotiated the convention, the 2030 development agenda, we wanted to make sure that disabilities was included into the agenda and also that was mainstreamed. I believe we did a good work in that regard, but it's not only member states. We are part of that equation, and I would like to say here quite clearly and loud the role of civil society in this process. The role of civil society was key in ensuring that when we negotiated the agenda, disabilities was one of the issues that during the different rounds was one issue that was highlighted by many of the state members, but also with a strong support from civil society. And that's why we made a difference in that regard. And so I would like to place on record our thanks and our appreciation for the efforts that civil society did during the whole process. You know what is in the 2030 development agenda. I believe that the Secretary General already mentioned that when he opened this event early this morning. And we know that there are different questions mentioned in the 17 goals of the agenda, in particular in relation with guaranteeing equal and accessible education, promoting inclusive economic growth, reducing inequality, making cities more inclusive, and collecting disaggregated data. Some of them have already been addressed, so I'm not going to go into detail, but these are some of the dimensions in which the issue of these disabilities is reflected into the agenda. Of course, we have human rights instruments, and in particular we have the Convention that is, for us, was a very helpful instrument when we undertook the negotiations of the 2030 agenda. The Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is, for countries like my country, is one of the best instruments to fight for the rights of people with disabilities, not only at the local level, regional, national level, but also at the international level. So we have to promote further ratifications of the Convention and to work towards universalization of the Convention. This is an aim that we have to have in mind and bring to the fore in every discussion that we have here at the United Nations on the issue of disabilities. Today we are speaking about invisible disabilities. And this is something that I believe that we have to reflect upon. What are these invisible disabilities? And what are the means for us to better act on these invisible disabilities at the international level? Of course, invisible disabilities is not included as a concept in the 2030 Development Agenda. We have to reflect on the issue and operationalization and definition of invisible disabilities, because if we believe that the aim is to achieve the full enjoyment of human rights by all persons with disabilities throughout the world, what we have to do first is to define, to identify who are these persons. And we have to collect high-quality, accessible, timely, reliable, and desegregated data on this. But of course, the first step is to get a definition on what precisely is invisible disabilities. I spoke at the beginning that I'm a father also, and as a father, I know that when you have to fight for the rights of your kids, the definition of the certain disabilities or special needs should be included into the national laws in order to get appropriate services in order to include in the educational system, into the health system, those persons that are affected by these issues. Invisible disabilities usually mean invisible vulnerabilities. And people tend to ignore those specificities that they cannot see. In fact, people often judge others by how they look, concluding that someone can or cannot do something just based on what they perceived. Therefore, in order to establish disability-specific indicators sensitive to all types of disabilities, and in order to focus on addressing inequality gaps, the first step, I insist, is to advance in discussion on what we understand for these kind of disabilities and how it interrelates with the idea of promoting mental health and well-being as included in the 2030 Development Agenda. The follow-up and full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals should seek to identify also the existence of invisible inequalities with a view to promote the enjoyment by all persons with disabilities of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The member states of the United Nations, the agencies, civil society should be ready to work together in order to create structural conditions that do not hinder the enjoyment of the rights of persons with invisible disabilities, respecting their inherent dignity, independence, and individual autonomy. More human and financial resources should be allocated to build capacities at national, regional, and international level to further understand the challenges posed by this kind of disabilities, taking into account that we committed ourselves to leave no one behind. This is a challenge that we have, and I believe that this is a very good opportunity to discuss at the international level this important dimension of the disabilities agenda. I hope we have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gallegos. Thank you very much, Akiko. And I hope we can further exchange views on this issue. Thank you.
I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Mateo Stream, especially for his very personal comments on this issue. We are dealing with a subject matter that has not been really assumed as an international discussion, which is invisible disability. Visible disability was defined as anything you can identify, but invisible disability is also a plethora of intellectual disabilities which in many cases societies do not know how to deal with adequately. I don't think the societies or individuals know how to deal with it adequately. I will invite Ms. Akiko Ito, Chief of the Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, for her opening remarks on behalf of the organization. Akiko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to follow footsteps of two extraordinary ambassadors who are deeply committed to the issue of disability, as well as showing us a vision for next steps. And thank you very much. I would also like to thank our co-organizers, United Nations University, University of Tokyo, and Nippon Foundation. I would also like to express my great appreciation for other panelists, my colleague from World Bank, Patricio. And then I also would like to express my deep appreciation to Ms. Kathleen Goetze, founder of IFRED, and also Ms. Vivian Pender from NGO Committee, the chair of the NGO Committee. I'd just like to say a few words because we have such a wealth of experiences and expertise in this field. From the United Nations perspective, persons with disabilities include all persons with disabilities, and as has been already discussed this morning, persons with disabilities, when we talk about disability, it includes mental disabilities, mental well-being, and mental health. And in this context, we have a number of General Assembly resolutions. As you recall, 2030 Development Agenda also makes references to this invisible issue, what used to be invisible issue. But now we are trying to bring much more light to this issue and to make it a central issue in the context of development and disability, so that we can finally really be true to the goal of our new agenda, leaving no one behind. We actually did a number of collaborations with our colleagues, with WHO, with United Nations University, University of Tokyo, to give depth to how UN can move forward with all the stakeholders. It's a richness of expertise, experiences, and the world-class academics who are with us doing this, who at this international day, and we are so pleased to also to mention that we are in the middle of also trying to see how best we can be useful to build a new network or strengthen network with our policymakers, our experts, our colleagues from Organization of Disabled Persons, who can also join forces in this issue, who have never perhaps dealt with this issue in the past, but that I think it's very important that we now face this new challenge of implementing this new global development agenda, and we need all expertise, we need all different backgrounds to be able to make concrete progress. So I would just like to leave it as this and just turn it over to Ambassador Gallegos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akiko, and I think I join Matteo, His Excellency Matteo Estrema, in congratulating you for the work your office does on behalf of disability. Due to the time constraints, I'm going to ask the panelists to limit their presentations within 5 minutes. First of all, I have on my list a good friend, Professor Takashi Isutsu from the University of Tokyo. He has been one of the key leaders who realized the integration of mental health and disability in UN policies and programs, including the SDGs. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gallegos. It's a great honor for me that I can work with you, especially in this room where you chair the ad hoc committee which created the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And as a co-organizer, first of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Estrema for your continuous support and leadership, and distinguished panelists, and the secretariat of this event, especially Akiko, Robert, and Atsuro, and all the colleagues and participants for making this important event possible. Thank you very much. Today, I would like to briefly share the current global situation regarding mental health, well-being, and disability. The slide, please. I would like to start with the annual number of deaths. According to WHO, every year, about 800,000 people die due to suicide. This is equivalent to the number of deaths due to war and murder combined. We have, for example, the Security Council and PKO for war, and police and judicial system for murder. However, many countries face extremely limited resources and systems to respond to suicide and other mental health conditions. Next, please. The WHO states that 1 out of 4 people will experience a mental health condition at least once in their lifetime. Suicide is the third cause of death among adolescents, and among adolescent girls, suicide is the leading cause of death. In developing countries, 80% of persons with severe mental illness do not receive appropriate treatment. Though there are misunderstandings that mental health is not related to death, according to OECD, persons with severe mental illness die 20 years earlier. The Global Burden of Disease study shows that depression is the leading cause of disability in the years lived with disability indicator. And economic cost is huge. Direct and indirect costs of mental illness exceeds 4% of GDP, according to OECD. Next, please. Despite these facts, situation around mental health and disability has been quite challenging. For example, the budget allocation for mental health in national health budget has been quite low. Among low-income countries, only 0.5% of the health budget is spent for mental health. Next, please. Human resources for mental health and disability has been also extremely limited. Taking psychiatrists as an example, WHO says about 40 countries do not have any psychiatrists. Social workers, community workers, and human rights advocates are also much lacking. Next, please. Though mental health, well-being, and disability have long been marginalized or ostracized in the international community despite its huge impact on our lives, it is drastically changing this year, 2015, since mental health and disability are included in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. This is a big achievement accomplished by persistent and strong efforts by member states, UN system, CSOs, academia, and many people, including persons with disabilities and their families worldwide. Next, please. Mental health and well-being is included in the Goal 3 of the SDGs, which is on good health. Among 9 health targets, Target 3.4 is on reducing mortality from non-communicable diseases and promote mental health and well-being. In addition, prevention and treatment of substance abuse is included in the Target 3.5, and further, disability is included in 5 goals in the SDGs. Next slide, please. In addition to the SDGs, this year, mental health and disability were integrated into another important global framework. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, adopted at the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, WCDRR, includes provision of psychosocial support and mental health services for all people in need as part of a priority. Next, please. The SDGs and the Sendai Framework, together with CRPD, have finally shed light on this neglected and invisible but critical important area at the global level. And various stakeholders are now getting together for action to realize mental well-being and inclusion for all. There are useful tools and guidelines developed by the UN system which can be utilized in this effort, and all of them are available through internet. Finally, mental health, well-being, and disability became a global priority. I hope we can continue our collaboration hand in hand to achieve our common goal of well-being, accessibility, and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your comments. I think that the presentation was a very illustrating one on how and what is happening in the world on this. Now, my next speaker is Dr. Atsuro Tsutsumi from the United Nations University, which is a think tank of the UN. Dr. Tsutsumi has organized a key UN experts group meeting on the issue, which enormously contributed to the inclusion of mental health and disability in the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So excuse me. It is a great honor for me to join this important discussion as a co-organizer, and I'd like to thank all the stakeholders who made this happen. Today, I'd like to briefly talk about new publication on mental health, well-being, and disability, which we developed to provide a foundation for this new era that mental health, disability are integrated in 2030 agenda and SDGs. Next slide, please. The title of the publication is Mental Health, Well-being, and Disability, a New Global Priority, Key United Nations Resolutions and Documents. This is an outcome of joint efforts by UNU, UN, the World Bank Group, WHO, and the University of Tokyo. It is unprecedented that all of these entities got together for mental health and disability, and I'd like to thank all those who contributed this effort. This publication aims at providing an overview of the history of mental health and disability in the UN and listing key resolutions of the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, and Economic and Social Council, and the practical tools and the guidelines related to this issue. We developed this publication in order to provide a key reference for future efforts to realize mental health and mental well-being and inclusion of persons with mental, intellectual, or psychosocial disabilities. This publication is already on the website of the UNU and available in both text and the PDF files. It will be also uploaded on the UN website soon. Next slide, please. Today, I'd like to briefly introduce some key messages from this publication. The first, utilizing a UN official document system, we employed a comprehensive document search of the UN resolutions which refer to mental health and disability. I'd like to summarize the outcome of the search from 1994 to 2015. A total of 371 GA resolutions referred to them during the search period. Of these resolutions, 1/3 of the resolution discuss issues on children and women. In addition, resolutions of human rights comprise a large part of these resolutions. 7 resolutions included the concepts related to mental health and disability among the Security Council resolutions, as well as in the Economic and Social Council. This shows that though we tend to assume mental health and disability have been marginalized in the international discourse, and that is true, but we also have a lot of foundations to realize the mental health for all and inclusion of persons with mental, intellectual, or psychosocial disabilities in terms of the UN resolutions. Next slide, please. As for the UN conventions which refer to mental health disability, 10 conventions and 8 optional protocols includes concepts related to mental health and disability. For example, ICSCR adopted in 1966 mentions the rights to health, which includes a specific mention to the rights to mental health. The CEDAW 1979 and the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted in 1989, have also included paragraphs on mental health and disability. The CRPD in 2006 includes persons with physical, mental, intellectual, and sensory impairments. Conventions are of great importance since they are legally binding among those states who ratified them. Next slide, please. Regarding the key outcome documents from the major UN global conferences, many outcome documents have already included mental health and disability, such as ICPD Program of Action and the Beijing Platform for Action out of the World Conference for Women. As we mentioned, the UN Sustainable Development Summit and the World Conference of Disaster Risk Reduction adopted the SDGs and the Sendai Framework, respectively, with including mental health disability in their key priorities. Upon this achievement, the international community now needs to collaborate to realize mental health and well-being, and to promote the rights of the persons with mental, intellectual, or psychosocial disabilities at all levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tusumi, let's just on a personal reference, I was a member of the CAT, the expert committee of the Convention on the Rights Against Torture, for almost 7 years, and in the meetings of the Convention Against Torture, many of the issues had to deal with mental health and the lack of understanding and knowledge and the internment of individuals. And just to reference a point which I would like to emphasize, if you commit a crime in a prison system, you go to jail, you spend the years you were sentenced to, and then you are free. But if you are interned in a psychological institution, in many cases is for life because there is no reprieve of the situation, which amounts to torture or ill treatment. I just wanted to make this as an important point of reference to. I would like to move on to the next presentation of Dr. Mark van Omeren from WHO. He could not physically attend this discussion, but kindly prepared a pre-recorded presentation. Could you play the slides, please?
Thank you for the organizers to giving time to discuss psychosocial disabilities of people in humanitarian settings. This is an extremely important topic, and a topic that has much momentum. When we think of people with severe mental disorders or psychosocial disabilities in emergencies, we need to think of one word: protection. People with these conditions deserve and often require protection, both in the community and in institutions. On the left, you see a photo of a person taken care of in Darfur. Taking care of is a big word. People are doing the best they can, but the person was abandoned underneath a tree. On the right side, you see a photo of what remains of the mental hospital in Aleppo. When war broke out, staff left, fighting happened in and around the hospital, and some of the patients were kidnapped. Horrible things happen to people with psychosocial disabilities in war and disaster settings. People with these conditions are vulnerable in emergencies. There are always often many people with severe mental disorders or psychosocial disabilities that are vulnerable. But in emergencies, this increases. It increases because care systems break down, both the health system and the social system. If people were on medicines, the medicines may no longer be available. If people had some family supports, family supports may not be there the same way. People may be abandoned. People may be shot by security forces when they do not understand instructions. We need to make sure there's protection and care for people with these conditions. Care needs to be integrated. Yes, in disability services, in health services, social services, in education services. Is there evidence on caring for people with psychosocial disabilities? Yes, there is. There is much evidence. Do we have policy and tools to help people in emergency settings? Yes, we do. We have numerous tools. And we have policy, including policy by the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the UN NGO Red Cross organ responsible for policy people in humanitarian settings. So we know what to do, and we have the evidence for it. Are there agencies helping people with psychosocial disabilities in emergencies? Not enough. But this is changing. We've seen in recent years a steep increase in number of agencies and number of programs working on care for the severe mentally ill in emergencies. We've seen an increase in programming by many agencies, including my own organization, WHO, the International ICRC, International Medical Corps, ACF, UNHCR, Save the Children, and others. There is momentum. Do we have all the answers? Do we know everything? No, not at all. We need to learn how to make care and protection much wider available. We're learning. Some things are going well, some things are not going well enough. There is much more to learn. We need to know much better on how to ensure both quality and large coverage in programs. We need to know how to supervise people who've been trained in giving care. We know how to supervise, but we don't know how to supervise at scale. We need to make sure that medicines are available for those who want and will benefit from medicines. We know which medicines there are. We have medicines in interagency emergency health kits, but we struggle with making sure there is uninterrupted supplies. We need to also learn much more on balancing a medical with a psychosocial approach. There are hard lessons, but there are also many success stories. For example, this slide is from Syria. It's about 6 months old, this slide. There will be too many numbers in here for you to really appreciate it, but if one looks carefully, one sees at the bottom that there's 130 health centers in Syria where healthcare staff trained in MHGAP, which is a tool for providing care of people with severe mental disorders in emergencies. And 130 centers is a lot, given that the whole country in total there has about 1,200 centers. So we are at about 16%, and of the country in Syria has there's access to mental health care and primary health care. That's not enough, but it is much better than 0%, which was the number before the emergency. In Afghanistan, over a 10-year period of time, more than 100,000 people were helped in one province, where people have done an ongoing long-term work on developing mental health care throughout humanitarian emergencies. You see, out of emergencies, good things can happen. Kosovo had in 2000 1 asylum and 6 inpatient wards. That was all it had for mental health services. And slowly over time things change, and you see by 2010 a much more diverse configuration of services, the asylum being closed and many services in the community. Indeed, this is a quite famous pyramid of WHO for service organization, and many countries have most of their money and services in the top and very little at the bottom, and that needs to be balanced. Emergencies are a good opportunity to get to use the status quo of interest in mental health to reorganize services. You see here a map of Sri Lanka. The yellow spots are where services are. You see in the left where services were around the time of the tsunami, and you see that the interest in mental health during the emergency created momentum to build a national mental health system that is still developing now. Let me end with a more personal example of Razmi, a teenage girl in Sri Lanka. After the tsunami, services were set up in her community. So here's what the case says. Razmi heard a talk at her school by a newly appointed community mental health worker. Later she asked the worker to visit her mother, who was at home and had become withdrawn, was hearing voices, and had difficulties functioning within the home and community. The worker visited the house, quickly identified her need for care, but her family was not so keen for her to receive care. They were worried about the stigma, they were worried what was going to happen to her. But eventually the family was convinced, and Rosmi was connected with new mental health services, and she benefited from the services. Later the father, who had been very much against the mother's receiving mental health care, the father became more trustful and disclosed to the community health worker that he had alcohol use problems and that he would like to deal with that. And he was also brought he also received necessary care. This was my last slide. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I hope you will take from this talk the key message that much can be done and much is increasingly things are being done for people with psychosocial disabilities in humanitarian settings. We hope that this topic will continue to increase in attention, and that it will also be considered during next year's World Humanitarian Talk. Thank you very much.
I have to thank the presentation by Dr. Omaran, and I think we appreciate all, especially the issue of the stigma that accompanies invisible disabilities. My next speaker is Dr. Patricio Marquez from the World Bank Group. Let me say that this looks like an Ecuadorian mafia, but it isn't, because Mr. Marquez is a member of the World Bank, and he has a very distinguished career in the World Bank, and he is an Ecuadorian like I am and like Lenin Moreno is, who work on disability. It is very exciting that the UN, WHO, and the World Bank got together for this important issue today at the UN. I'm going to say something that I shouldn't, but it is probably the first time in history. Dr. Marquez has been spearheading various health programs at the World Bank, including recent efforts to respond to Ebola outbreaks, crisis in the southern corner of Africa, as well as all the programs on mental health. The floor is yours, my distinguished colleague.
Ambassador Gallegos, as he said, a fellow compatriot of me, Ms. Akiko Ito, head of the Secretariat of the UN Convention on Persons with Disabilities, fellow panel members, colleagues all. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event for inviting us to participate on this important panel that is focusing on a critical development challenge. So on behalf of the World Bank, I would like to reiterate that we share your views about the importance of this topic. It is clear, colleagues, and that's at the root of our position, that the inclusion of people of all abilities has to be at the core of sustainable development. It is clear, as we have heard this morning, that there are billions of people across the globe living with a disability. Some of those disabilities are obvious, other disabilities are not so. And the rest of us, by virtue of being human, are vulnerable to having or develop in the future a disability at some point. Today, colleagues, is a good time to reflect on this. The World Bank Group is committed to do the work and not only the talk about the social moral imperative of removing barriers to promote inclusion and to change attitudes about disability inside and outside our institution. Internally, at the World Bank, we are striving to allow all our staff with or without disabilities to fully and equally participate in our work and be part of our mission of decreasing and eliminating extreme poverty and increase shared prosperity by the year 2030. We at the World Bank also recognize the importance of inclusion in our development work. In many places, as we have heard this morning, persons with disabilities face barriers and lack of equal access to transport, to employment, as well as to essential services. So we all should be excited, and actually we are welcome that excitement around the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that all persons, including persons with disabilities, benefit from the 2030 Development Agenda. In doing so, and fully consistent with the purpose of this panel, I will like to reiterate that we need to focus and to attach a special priority to promote and bring forward the issue of the invisible disabilities as a barrier to society, as a barrier to development, as a barrier to more integrated and sustainable countries. Colleagues, this is long due. This call is long due. The efforts, as we have seen in this panel, are long due. Persons with mental and psychological disabilities represent, as we have heard from our colleague, Professor Takeshi, a significant proportion of the world's population with special needs. Millions of people are affected by different forms of mental disorders. And 1 in 4 people globally will experience a mental disorder in their lifetime. And one of the distracting factors is that among the youth, unfortunately, that's leading to an epidemic of suicides. Recent reports show that among young girls aged 15 and 19 years globally, suicide has become the leading cause of death, surpassing maternal mortality. Aside from facing entrenched stigma and discrimination, as we heard before from Ambassador Gallegos, as well as physical and sexual abuse in homes, hospitals, prisons, or as homeless people in the streets, persons affected by mental disorders are excluded from social, economic, and political activities. We need to be clear, however, and accept the reality, as Ambassador Mateo clearly articulated, that ill mental health is not only limited to persons with severe mental disorders confined to psychiatric hospitals. Ill mental health is a widespread and often invisible phenomenon. As Ambassador Mateo said, many of us, or our parents, our partners, sons and daughters, have felt a sense of loss of detachment from families, friends, and regular routines. We also have experienced nervousness and anxiety about changes in our personal and professional lives, as well as real or imagined fears or worries that have distracted, confused, and agitated us. While these episodes tend to be transitory for most of us, some of these conditions force us to take frequent breaks from work, or we need to take time off from work or leave of absence because we are stressed and depressed, or because the medication that we are taking to alleviate a mental disorder makes it difficult for us to get up early in the morning or concentrate at work. And on occasions, because of these disorders, some fall into alcoholism and substance abuse, further aggravating fear attacks or sense of alienation from loved ones and daily routines. And also, colleagues, as I was able to witness this year, or this past year in West Africa when I was co-coordinating the Ebola emergency response, the mental disorders can be triggered when massive social dislocations occur. Ebola in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone is an example, as well as the financial crisis of 2008 in cities such as New York, or civil conflicts in Central America, tend to precipitate these conditions. So what to do? I think that it's very clear that we cannot close our eyes anymore to this invisible disability. We have to make it visible. And the best way to do that is by promoting the development and implementation of a multi-sectoral agenda for action. Yes, one entry point is the progressive realization of universal health coverage in order to ensure that people that need care have access to essential services, and that they don't have to spend out of pocket large amounts of money in order to get those services or to buy medications. So they need to have, as part of universal health coverage, financial protection to protect them from the impoverishment impact of ill health, in this case, mental ill health. But also, the professor from Japan this morning clearly articulated and indicated that mental health cannot be seen only as a biological phenomenon. In large measure, it's a social phenomenon. Therefore, we need to think that there are multiple ways to deal with this phenomenon and avoid medicalizing mental health. And we have to find entry points in education, social protections, in employment, the job market, in order to bring these people back into the communities as active members of the communities, as productive members of the communities, in order to live healthy, productive, and happy lives. The World Bank, as I said, we are committed, and in order to start operationalizing a broader multi-sectoral response across the world, in partnership with the World Health Organization colleagues and different organizations across the world, including the Nippon Foundation, and my good friend Akiko, representing the UN Convention, we are organizing a global event to coincide with the April 2016 spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the goal of this meeting is to launch a broad movement of action to tackle this invisible disability by stressing the social impact, the economic impact of inaction. We cannot, as I said before, continue to keep our eyes closed. The time has arrived, colleagues, to open our eyes and make this invisible visibility visible. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias, Patricio. Thank you, Patricio, for your intervention. I find it extremely illuminating for all of us. And let me also emphasize the work that the Nippon Foundation has done on this, not only by vocational training and aiding on issues of individual, but you said it correctly. It is time that we move forward with an agenda of multi-stakeholders on this issue, and I congratulate you for the initiative of the April meeting in Washington. Now I would like to welcome Catherine Gotsk. I hope I pronounced that close. The founder of the IFRED, a nonprofit organization of depression dedicated to encouraging research on depression and reducing the stigma associated with the disease. The floor is yours, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today and for organizing this and for all of your leadership and advocacy on this issue. It just means the world to me, so I really appreciate that. I'm also really grateful that we give respect to the 1+ billion people globally with disabilities, including those with mental, intellectual, and psychosocial disabilities. It's been a year since I've been at the United Nations, and so much has happened in mental health advocacy. And I feel like we really have a lot to celebrate. The inclusion of mental health in the Sustainable Development Goals, it seemed like a daunting task. And yet there is inclusion in not just one, but multiple locations throughout the document. And it is historic, and I give thanks for that. I'm here today on behalf of myself, my foundation IFRED, and Fundamental SDG, which is a group of global mental health experts and advocates, and also the 600 million people with mental disabilities, and mostly invisible, to ask that you now add indicators to the Sustainable Development Goals so that we can see and measure progress. We must give countries measurements through these indicators and hold them accountable to action. And many speakers gave the why for today. There is adequate research that including mental health helps us meet other sustainable development goals, not to mention the $16 trillion projected cost of the economy for not doing so. The human rights crisis alone must initiate serious and immediate action. So today I'm going to take a more personal approach, as I believe my story has relevance and insight. My father was one of my greatest mentors. He was energetic, brilliant, and he was committed to our family. He came from little and made an impressive life for himself. He got a master's degree and he became a vice president of the First National Bank of Chicago. Everyone loved him, his generosity to others, and his passion for life. He provided us kids experiences few people had, including Walmart annual meetings and learning from retailer great Sam Walton. On one particular annual meeting float trip, he even ensured I was the one that got to ride in the canoe with Jim Walton, where we got stuck in the rainstorm and Jim built me a fire. It is a priceless memory for me, and all due to my dad's enthusiasm for life and his desire for my happiness. As maybe you can imagine, it was a total devastation when I was a freshman in college and I called my dad from my dorm room only to hear a deep, unrecognizable voice on the phone. It was a policeman. My father had taken his life. In that one life-altering second, I lost my greatest hero, a person I admired, a person I counted on and loved more than anything in the world. I lost my dad. And I wish my story of depression and suicide ended there, tragic though it is. Unfortunately, as it is no surprise genetically, I struggled myself with depression and spent years escaping with alcohol, smoking, and other addictions, all societal burdens that come as a consequence for untreated depression. In my early 20s, even after losing my father and never ever wanting that pain on another person, I attempted to take my own life. It is a miracle that I am here today. That shocking wake-up call got me to treatment. It gave me the health and focus to get an MBA in international business and the necessary energy to work for Fortune 500 companies, becoming a productive contributor to the global economy. I then created my own successful company, The Mood Factory, with a consumer brands at Lowe's with over 5 million sold. In my darkest time, I never would have imagined that possible. Getting my brain healthy also inspired me to start a foundation for depression called IFRED to eradicate stigma and rebrand depression using celebrity engagement, the sunflower's international symbol for hope, and a curriculum for 10-year-olds based on research that hope is a teachable skill. IFRED and global mental health advocacy is my way of giving back to something that has taken so much. It is an understatement when I say that I have been blessed by my access to mental health care. Unfortunately, most don't have access to treatment and won't get it due to stigma. 400 million around the world plus have depression, yet less than 50% are receiving treatment, and even up to 80 to 90% in many countries. And that is even though we have proven cost-effective and money-saving treatments. We lose almost 1 million people a year to suicide, more than war and homicides combined, and it is treatable. So tragically, as they were saying, suicide is now the leading cause of death for adolescent girls. Our young girls getting ready for a full life are choosing instead to end it early. In fact, 1 in 9 children in the United States are self-reporting suicide attempts prior to graduating high school. This must change. I believe stigma is the reason my father isn't here with me today and why it took me so long to get my own help. Stigma is, quite simply, a negative brand, a misperception, a lack of understanding, and inadequate information. And what we don't understand, we often fear. Stigma impacts everything: funding, access to treatment, compliance, and relationships. Us working together to change stigma changes everything. My late mentor, Mr. Paul Carter, continued my dad's traditions and took me to a few Saturday morning meetings at Walmart. I was lucky enough to see Nancy Brinker from the Susan G. Komen Foundation speak about breast cancer in the 90s, also once a highly stigmatized disease. I then watched how she and others transformed the stigma of breast cancer through policy, celebrity engagement, education, and the iconic pink ribbon. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what my dad would have done had he lived. I watched his colleagues do extraordinary things, becoming executives of large corporations, institutions, banks, creating massive positive change in the world. I know had he made it through this difficult time, he would have come out the other side 10 times stronger. So I stand today in solidarity with depression survivors, those impacted by the loss of someone they love to suicide, and others needing mental health support, including those impacted by autism, Asperger's, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. I stand with the 1+ billion impact by disabilities globally. I stand in solidarity with those in chains and the 1 in 9 children feeling so hopeless they attempt to take their own life before even graduating high school. I believe creating specific indicators in the Sustainable Development Goals is one of the most important things we can do today to end stigma and ultimately provide access to care. It is not a suggestion, it is a must. For these indicators send a clear message to our world from the global leaders that there is no shame in asking for help, that we are not invisible, that the United Nations believes in treatment, equality, and human dignity for all. Thank you so much.
Catherine, thank you very much for your very personal discourse, and we join you in this. We also believe in the indicators will help, but your example is worthy of making it more public to those millions of people who have depression. Last but not least, I would like to welcome Dr. Vivian Pender, Special Advisor of the American Psychiatric Association and the Chair of the NGO Committee on Mental Health for the UN. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for organizing this panel, and it's really an honor to join you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, NGO representatives, ladies and gentlemen. What we may call invisible disabilities may in fact be detectable by an informed, knowledgeable, careful society. This knowledge, I believe, will make the invisible visible. What I will talk about is early symptoms and early interventions. The American Psychiatric Association has found that 50% of all mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and psychosocial disabilities begins by age 14. And 75% begins by age 24. So this is happening at early ages, and there are signs that, if noticed by informed individuals, can alter the course. An informed and knowledgeable society will help to decrease stigma and value all individuals. Major mental disabilities such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder rarely appear spontaneously without prodromal indicators. Most often, family, friends, teachers, or individuals themselves begin to recognize small changes or a feeling that something is not quite right or something is different about their thinking, their feelings, or their behavior, way before one of these disabilities appears in a full-blown form. Learning about developing symptoms or early signs and taking action can help. Early intervention can help reduce the severity of a disability. It may even be possible to delay or prevent a major mental disability altogether. Knowledge is power and an antidote to fear of the unknown. The American Psychiatric Association advises that if several of the following are occurring, so these are some early symptoms, it may be useful to follow up with a mental health professional. Withdrawal, like social withdrawal, loss of interest. Decreased functioning. Problems thinking. Increased sensitivity. Apathy. Feeling disconnected. Illogical thinking. Nervousness and agitation. Unusual behavior. Sleep or appetite changes. Mood changes. And of course, suicidal thought or intent. One or two of these symptoms alone can't predict a mental disability, but if a person is experiencing several at one time and the symptoms are causing serious problems in the ability to study, work, or relate to others, he or she should be seen by a mental health professional. Taking action and getting help. More than decades of research around the world have shown that early interventions can often minimize or delay symptoms and improve prognosis. We advise having an evaluation if it's possible, learning about mental disability, including the signs and symptoms, receiving supportive counseling about daily life and strategies for stress management, and monitoring closely for conditions that require more intensive care. Each individual's situation must be assessed carefully and demand comprehensive treatments that, like those provided by the NGOs that are part of the Committee on Mental Health, to prevent early symptoms from progressing into serious disability. Ongoing individual and family counseling, vocational and educational support, participation in problem-solving groups, and medications when appropriate. Family members are valued partners and should be involved whenever possible. And learning about mental disability and what is happening in the brain can help individuals and families understand the significance of symptoms and how a disability might develop and what can be done to help. Early intervention programs require education, awareness, and funding for families, communities, and professionals. Many mental health professionals remain dedicated to making the invisible visible by providing training and education. Just as with other medical illnesses, early intervention can make a crucial difference in preventing what could become a serious disability. There is a saying that there is no health without mental health. And I would just like to say a few words about suicide, and then I will stop. Each year, there have been a lot of statistics, but in the United States alone, there is a suicide every 15 minutes just to put that in dramatic relief. Every 15 minutes, a person commits suicide just in the United States alone. So the numbers are greater worldwide. Men are nearly 4 times more likely than women to take their lives, and yet suicide can be preventable. Knowing the risk factors, the warning signs, and protective factors are very important. I think some of the warning signs have been spoken about. A history of suicide in the family, increased alcohol use, withdrawal, reckless behavior, dramatic mood changes. Sometimes an immediate stressor or a sudden catastrophic event can cause a kind of tipping point. And if someone indicates that they are considering suicide, listen and take their concerns seriously. And don't be afraid to ask about their plans, to ask about how they're feeling. Asking a person if they are considering or thinking about suicide does not cause the person to become suicidal. If anything, it can offer relief. Let them know that you care. So there are risk factors for suicide that we've also spoken about. And there are protective factors, effective mental health care, strong connections to individuals, problem solving and conflict resolution skills, and contact with providers. As with mental disabilities, one of the biggest barriers to preventing suicide is stigma, and one of the best antidotes is knowledge. And that could offer a great deal of help to many people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. That is the last of my panels. We are more than an hour and 15 minutes off schedule on this case. I just would like to end with these very few thoughts. I'd like to thank the panel for their insightful and inspiring discussions. I feel that this discussion will be inclusive and accessible to all, including persons with intellectual disabilities and persons with mental and psychological disabilities. We need to make these invisible disabilities visible, as many of the panelists have insisted, and included in our efforts to promote inclusion and universal accessibility, to eliminate stigma, which I think is the predominant word that has been mentioned on this panel. I am convinced that now is the time to strengthen our commitment and effort to promote the rights of persons with mental, intellectual, and psychological disabilities, and truly and finally realize mental health and well-being for all people of the world. I would like to thank you very much for your presence here today, and stop the panel and thank you again, and thank the audience for its patience. Thank you.
So we will start in a minute, and I would be very grateful if you could be seated for the next panel discussion. Operationalizing the 2030 Development Agenda, Disability Data Statistics, Indicators, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Inclusive Development. We are starting in 1 minute. Please kindly be seated. Good afternoon. So welcome to this panel on operationalizing 2030 Development Agenda for Sustainable Development. And we have such a distinguished panels, and we have time limitation. So I would just like to start by saying that that this panel has been co-organized by a number of our colleagues that you can see in our program. So I'm not going to repeat our co-sponsors for the entire day and for this panel. Okay. So let me just preface this panel discussion by saying that this issue has been one of the key issues, one of the core issues in the work of the United Nations in the field of disability. I recall the document 1982, the World Program of Action Concerning Disabled Persons, already mentioned the importance of data statistics and also referred to the importance of having evidence-based approach to disability and development, so that we can take concrete steps for full and effective participation of persons with disabilities in society and development, which is the goal of the United Nations work in the field of disability. And in the field of disability data statistics, monitoring, evaluation, we come from the policy side. We are looking at how we can implement 2030 Development Agenda, 2030 Development Goals. And in the past, with MDGs, many of us here and many participants here may be aware that we had rather scarce data, and we had rather limited, again, information about the situation of persons with disabilities without having any internationally comparable measures to identify persons with disabilities in a context of society and development in their situation. Since then, we have had a number of progress, including the international comparable measures developed by Washington Group. We have now the political commitment, as I already mentioned, the number of General Assembly resolutions over decades. We have the convention. We even have again, a commitment that have been expressed every time we have a major intergovernmental disability conference, such as Conference of States Parties. I counted last year in June how many states mentioned disability data statistics and the need for evidence-based work to advance policy implementation, policy development, policy implementation. There were more than 2/3 of, out of at that time, almost 155 states parties mentioned that they consider this area to be the priority. So I think we have this strong commitment, and we do have major tools, and we have another, again, new framework, development framework that helps us to, to bring our forces together for this commitment. So I do believe that this is a wonderful opportunity for us. And our panelists today will discuss how this, what they envisage will be some solutions as to for present and for midterm and then for long term. I'm going to ask my colleague, Ms. Maria Martinho, to moderate this panel, since she started her important contribution to develop an informal network for the benefit of preparing for UN flagship report in 2 years to have more comprehensive, again, understanding of the situation of persons with disabilities in society development. And we will have this, this report in 2 years' time, and she has been working very hard to build a network so that as Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which produces this report in close coordination with our UN colleagues, we can benefit from, again, many networks, many experts' views and their expertise, perhaps including you. So please, if you wish to actually learn more about our network, please get in touch with us. So without further ado, I would ask my colleague, Ms. Maria Martinho, to take over. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It will be a pleasure for me to continue to moderate this panel with such distinguished panelists. Many of them are very known for their work on disability statistics. So this panel has been organized around 5 questions, which I would like to ask the panelists to consider in their interventions. So the first question is about internationally comparable measures for disability. Some of them have already been developed. How can we scale up their usage worldwide? The second question is about the SDG indicators. So what can we do to get better disaggregation of data by disability for the SDG indicators? The third question is also about the SDGs. There are a number of targets that concern accessibility of schools, of public and green spaces, and of transport. So how can accessibility indicators and data be developed to monitor the implementation of those targets? And then the 2 last questions are a little bit more on the modern and sophisticated side of things. So the fourth question is about the data revolution. A lot has been said about it in the last 2-3 years when talking about the post-2015 development agenda. So how can persons with disabilities benefit from that process? And the fifth question is about technology, especially information and communication technology. How can this be used to better monitor and implement the 2030 agenda for persons with disabilities? So we will start this panel with an intervention from Ambassador Caitlin Wilson. She's the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Australia to the United Nations. Her intervention will be followed by interventions of a number of experts on disability statistics from the UN system and also from the Washington Group on disability statistics. And then at the end of the panel, we'll have interventions from disabled persons organizations and also from the Institute on Disability and Public Policy. After the interventions, I hope we'll have some space maybe for discussion, maybe not because we are very late. But this being said, and since we are late, without further ado, I'm now going to give the floor to Your Excellency Ambassador Wilson, Deputy Permanent Representative from the Permanent Mission of Australia. Ambassador Wilson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martinho, and to UNDESA for inviting us to speak today, and of course for bringing us all together. We think it's a great opportunity to learn from one another and to collaborate towards a shared goal. So from that point of view, even though I'm certainly not an expert, I'm very pleased and honoured to be here. Australia and the Australian government has been a very strong supporter of promoting different ways of improving inclusion and also looking at ways to ensure that our development outcomes recognise disabilities. So the evidence base becomes extremely important for us, and we also very much believe that building better evidence and data on the situation of people with disabilities is critical to driving real change and also ultimately bettering the daily experience of people with disabilities. So the evidence is critical. I'm going to talk to the first two questions that you've proposed, and also in the interest of just trying to be succinct, and obviously with other experts being here, they'll have much to contribute. So I'm just opening the discussion here very much. But thinking about promoting and scaling up internationally comparable measures and what the challenges and opportunities might be in disaggregating data. So in terms of data, we see data being essential at a number of levels. In terms of the constraints at the global level, we know that the absence of reliable internationally comparable data on disability can lead to governments underestimating the nature and prevalence rates of disabilities. And this in turn can very much undermine comprehensive action on disability, including allocation of resources and effective policy responses, including those that draw on evidence from other countries in comparable situations. It can also impede or prevent the international community from knowing who is being left behind in our global development efforts. And when we consider that one of the themes of the post-2015 negotiations leading to the 2030 agenda was leaving no one behind, this becomes a critical element. We also see disability data being very important at the national level. So at the national level, without this sort of data, it's too easy for decision makers to overlook the inclusion of people in specific policies and programs. So again, we are not as well informed if we don't have the data or evidence to support it. One of the areas that the Australian government is committed to is supporting global and national disability data collection and analysis. We have reflected this as a guiding principle underpinning the Australian aid program's strategy for strengthening disability inclusive development, and that's reflected in our strategy Development for All 2015 to 2020. In that strategy, without going into too much detail, but it recognises that robust evidence is required for effective disability inclusive development. This includes research which allows us to better understand challenges and opportunities for people with disabilities globally, but also in particular country context, as we certainly recognise that on a country-by-country basis the situations are different. Going to the disaggregation issue, we also very much see that disaggregation helps us to understand and assess the extent to which development efforts reach and benefit people with disabilities. So it's not just about what types of plans and programs are in place, but also what the outcomes and the impact is. So if we give an example, disaggregated data is required to ascertain whether both girls and boys with disabilities are attending school. We think that there's already some good news because we already have many of the tools needed to collect and analyse disability data. So it's, the next step is focusing on promoting their use worldwide. I'll offer a couple of practical examples, and it also links to the introduction from Dessa. Australia is specifically working to encourage greater uptake of the Washington Group disability questions, as well as their capacity to provide regular technical training to National Statistics officers. And we found that this is particularly useful in developing countries where resources are not necessarily available domestically to implement larger and more comprehensive surveys. And we also know that surveys are incredibly difficult, even for a country such as Australia, which has comparatively large resources and technical capacity. Another thing that we're doing is to support UNICEF and the Washington Group to develop survey questions that countries can include in their existing national data collection processes, for example, census processes. And this can very much help to provide internationally comparable data on children with disabilities. And we also think that this will flow on to the development of a second set of survey questions to help us understand that the barriers that children with disabilities face when accessing quality education. And a third example, we're also supporting the establishment of a disability statistics team within the UN Statistics Division. We're partnering very closely with the Statistics Division in a range of areas. And this collaboration, we are hoping, will enhance the knowledge base on disability statistics, help to collect existing disability statistics from available sources, and also to provide guidance at both international and national levels on collection and analysis of disability data. So again, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from representatives from UNICEF, the Washington Group, UN Statistical Division, so that some of their thinking and ideas can be elaborated. We know that there are a number of challenges in collecting disaggregated data, and without very specific ideas, but we would like to see where innovative technological solutions could be applied, and we do see that some of this is happening already. We know that there now exists a range of apps for smartphones that enable data to be collected in remote villages, so either for smartphones or for tablets, and these can later be connected and uploaded for easy collation and analysis. So the technology is great and it can be harnessed to fill in some of the existing gaps in data collection and use. While Australia considers disaggregated data a critical launching point, we also would like to conclude, though, by saying that the absence of such data should not justify inaction. So at the bottom line is that we need to continue to find ways to improve the lives of people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wilson, and thanks for ending with a note of what is the ultimate goal is really not to leave anyone behind. And it was a pleasure to hear about the activities that Australia is supporting to promote the collection and analysis of data on disability, and we hope this will help us implement the 2030 agenda. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Linda Hooper from the United Nations Statistics Division, where she works as a statistician. She's part of a team which is acting as a secretariat for the Interagency and Expert Group on SDG indicators. And we would very much like to hear from her how this process is including disability and how it can help operationalize the 2030 agenda for persons with disabilities. Mrs. Hooper, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for inviting the Statistics Division. As Maria said, I'm part of the Sustainable Development Goals Monitoring Unit. I'll be updating you on the work of the Interagency Expert Group on SDG indicators towards the development of the global indicator set, and also discuss the concept of leaving no one behind and how indicators for data for persons with disability are being included in the indicator set. So in the so important progress has been made over the last months in the indicator proposal, global indicator proposal, which will be reviewed by the Statistical Commission in its next session in March of 2016. The IAEG SDGs was established this past March by the Statistical Commission. The membership of the group is made up of 28 representatives from member states' statistical offices. Member states are the heart of the work of the Interagency and Expert Group. Over the past months, the groups worked very hard to conduct its proceedings and ongoings in an open, inclusive, and transparent manner, having invited experts from civil society, academia, private sector to contribute to consultations and contribute their expertise and specialized views on specific indicators. Recently at the the September summit, the important mandate to the Statistical Commission for the development and implementation of the 2030 Agenda was reconfirmed. As was stated in the 2030 Agenda in paragraph 75, the global indicator framework is being developed by the IAEG SDGs, which will be agreed by the Statistical Commission and adopted thereafter by the Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly in line with existing mandates. The IAEG SDGs is working intensely to ensure that the global indicator framework addresses all sustainable development goals and targets, including the means of implementation, while preserving the political balance, integrity, and ambitions contained within the agenda. This past October, over 250 participants attended the second meeting of the Interagency Expert Group, where there were close to 200 observers from member states that are not members of the IAEG, international and regional organizations, civil society, academia, and private sector. The meeting reached agreement on a set of over 220 indicators, of which 160 are considered green, meaning that there were no serious concerns expressed by the members, and that there was sufficient clarity on the way in which they would be implemented. The remaining indicators were considered gray, meaning that although members had agreed to include them, there are several methodological and conceptual issues that need to be clarified, and the exact formalization would be formalized after the more research had been conducted. The meeting also had agreed to have a further consultation on the indicators that were determined green. In that Bangkok meeting, this consultation happened in early November, and we received over 700 inputs. These inputs have been taken into consideration in the past weeks as the members finalized the green indicators. As we all know, the principle of the 2030 Agenda is to ensure that no one is left behind. The sustainable development reaches the most vulnerable people. Data disaggregation is important, but we need to note that data disaggregation is not always enough. Oftentimes, data collection tools or survey questions might need to be re-examined to determine if they're not hidden or not so hidden biases in the design or implementation. The work that's been done by the Washington Group is an example of a way to develop more tools in order to measure, to improve data collection. So to be in line with the new agenda, and specifically paragraph 74G of the document, the Interagency and Expert Group agreed upon a statement regarding disaggregation that will serve as a chapeau of the global indicator set. The statement reflects the wording in paragraph 74G and target 17.8 and includes a statement that disaggregation should be in accordance with the fundamental principles of official statistics. The note on data disaggregation reads, SDG indicators should be disaggregated where relevant by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and geographic location, or other characteristics in accordance with the fundamental principles of official statistics. As we all know, there are 6 targets with specific reference to persons with disability. The Interagency and Expert Group members have taken notice of this and are committed to ensuring that indicators for these targets are able to measure the situation of persons with disabilities. The indicators for these targets were coded green after the Bangkok meeting. There was strong support during the open consultation, and IAEG members are ensuring that the elements of disability are included either through disaggregation by persons with disability or as in target 11.2 reference to accessibility by persons with disability. Thus, concerns raised by advocates from persons with disability are being explicitly addressed in the indicator formulation for these targets. Currently, we're working on the gray indicators. Our team has been reviewing the inputs received from the July to September consultations and questionnaires sent to members before the October meeting of the group. So in order to continue our spirit of having an open, inclusive, and transparent proceedings of the group, we want to announce that the consultation for the gray indicators will open next Wednesday so it'll be the 9th of December through the 15th of December, available for observers and other stakeholders. If you look at the IAAG's website, you'll find the link when it's made available next week for this additional consultation on the gray indicators. The work that we've been doing on the green indicators and the gray indicators will be reflected in the report to the Statistical Commission, in which indicators for all SDG targets, the background information on the process to develop the indicators, an outline on a process for updating and future work plans will be included. Ultimately, the final decision of the number, type, and formulation of indicators in the Global Indicator Framework proposal rests with the IAAG members. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for the intervention and for updating us on the status of the development of the SDG indicators. We welcome the fact that the interagency and expert group are considering disability and how it can be reflected on the targets mentioning disability, but also on the other indicators throughout the framework. So I'll move now to another colleague from the United Nations Statistics Division, Mrs. Margaret Mbogoni. She's an old colleague working on disability statistics. She used to be many years ago the focal point for disability statistics at the UN Statistics Division, and she's back into that position again. So she has a lot of expertise in that area, and she has, for example, contributed to the development of the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health. And she's now also working closely with our colleagues from Australia on actually enhancing capacity building from countries worldwide. So we will very much welcome hearing from Mrs. Mbogoni on exactly what UN Statistics Division is doing and plans to do in the future, in the next 15 years, so that we have better data on disability. Mrs. Mbogoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. I have a PowerPoint presentation. It's coming up? Okay. Okay, while it's coming up, the title of my presentation is United Nations Disability Statistics Program in Support of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So my name is Margaret Mbogoni. I'm a statistician in the Demographic Statistics branch, Demographic and Social Statistics in the UN Statistics Division. As you've heard over and over again today, there is a need for data to monitor and to plan for persons with disabilities. I cannot emphasize that enough. But what I will say is that it is imperative that the data we collect, it's not just any data. They should be fit for purpose so that they are meaningful for use in the countries where these sustainable development goals have to be implemented. More than ever before, action is needed in the countries, not even in the countries, not at the global level, but down at the local level where planning gets implemented. So for that matter, we need adequate, reliable, and accurate data to monitor the situation of persons with disabilities, to ensure their inclusiveness in the societies in which they live. Information available in the UN Statistics Division shows that national efforts to collect data on disability have gone up over the decades. I will use an example taken from our census program. In the 1970 census round, which started in the mid-1960s, only 19 countries collected data on disability through their census. By the 20,000 round, which spanned the period 1995 to 2004, this number had gone up to 103 countries. And for the current round, the last time we checked, which was towards the end of 2013, 94 countries had already included a question on disability in their censuses. When we do the final tally, we think that many more countries will have included disability as a topic in their countries. In spite of all these efforts to collect data, particularly through censuses, there is still lack of comparability among the countries regarding how disability is defined, the concepts used, and consequently how it is measured, again with reference to use in the censuses. For instance, when we looked at the 2010 census round towards the end of 2013, we looked at questionnaires from 124 countries, of which 94 had included a question on disability. But among these 94, we found that 23 used the approach suggested by the Washington group, 22 still collected information using impairments, another 40 used other approaches. But even within those that used the Washington group approach, there are many variations on how this was operationalized within the countries. So where are we now? Now we are at a new juncture, this new juncture being the beginning of the 2020 World Population and Housing Census Program, which spans the period 2015 to 2024. Oh, okay, I thought it was finished. Okay. Thank you, Maria. I thought my time was up. Okay, so to kickstart the 2020 census round, the Economic and Social Council passed a resolution this last June, in which it stressed the importance of censuses as a source for data for inclusive socio-economic development, also as a source for assessing situation of special population groups, including persons with disabilities. For the first time, the census resolution includes reference to persons with disabilities. In the context of this meeting, we are talking about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This agenda has reference to no one will be left behind, and also reaching the farthest behind first, and in that context recognizes persons with disabilities as one of the vulnerable groups. Next, please. So as you've heard from the representative of the government of Australia, the UN Statistics Division has received a grant from the government of Australia, and we are very grateful to Australia for this, to implement a project on disability statistics. This project is 4 years, started this year, and will end in the year 2019. Its main objective is to enhance the capacity of national statistical offices to produce and disseminate good quality and fit-for-purpose statistics on disability for evidence-based policy making and monitoring. It looks like a simple statement, but it has so many angles to it. Next, please. Within this project, we have two expected accomplishments. The first one is to formulate international guidelines for measurement of disability, taking into account existing instruments, good national practices, and country experiences. To this end, we want to recognize the contribution and the good work that the Washington Group has carried out over the years to come up with the measures of disability through the census and an extended one for a sample, through sample surveys. But now that we are back in the system, we want to work with the Washington Group and other players. There are other players, including, for instance, WHO. We have UNICEF here with us. There are others. We want to get together and come up with a book that says United Nations recommendations for measurement of disability statistics. To also work with the countries, look at their experiences. Why is it that in spite of what we have so far in terms of recommendations, countries are still asking questions the way they are? We want to understand their needs. We want to work with them so that we have practical guidelines that will enable them to collect the information they need. The second accomplishment will be to enhance the capacity of national statistical systems to collect and generate relevant and quality disability statistics that are based on international guidelines. Next, please. Next, please. So as I already mentioned, with regard to the guidelines, we will build on ongoing endeavors and existing measures and take into account the experiences of the countries and go through a consultative process. Here I want to mention that the involvement of countries is important for getting measures that are applicable and relevant for their needs and for generating the data that are fit for purpose. Because at the end of the day, it's the countries that really need the data. And that data has to be really relevant, and in order for it to be relevant, they have to be in the capacity of the countries. We want sustainable data for the SDGs on disability. Within this context, we want to pay special attention to the data poor countries, the countries that don't have many sources from which they are able
So I was just informed that it will take a few minutes to solve this technical problem. We are trying to get the subtitles back on and also the presentation. So if you could please bear with us, and apologies for this technical difficulty.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so developing the capacity of countries will pay special attention to the data poor countries, the developing countries with statistical systems that aren't very developed, that don't have many sources through which they collect information on disability. Experience at the UN Statistics Division from way back from the time when I worked on disability statistics, even now, is that for many developing countries, the only source of data is through population and housing censuses. But then, as we've heard over and over again, sustainable development goals are so far-reaching that there is a need to harness all available sources of data. That said, those sources have to be reliable and credible in order not to give a misleading picture about the situation of persons with disabilities. So in that context, we will work with countries, especially developing countries, on the importance of developing and exploiting multiple data sources. My office already has an ongoing program on civil registration vital statistics systems. In that context, we will continue to help the countries to further develop and strengthen their systems. There is a new initiative starting on helping countries with a survey program. Within that context, too, we will work with the countries to see how this source can be exploited for generating data on disability. Then we will also work on enhancing countries' capacities to use appropriate technologies with regard to the census, with regarding to being able to connect different sources of data, with regard to data visualization and dissemination. Next, please. In terms of the modalities for enhancing national capacity, we will rely on training workshops, on measurement of disability. Within this broad one, we will also include training that is related to the census. The census, when it comes to leave no one behind, is a very good source of data because it covers everyone in the country. So you have data on everyone in the country regarding where they live and their basic socioeconomic characteristics. But we also know that for more details, you need sample surveys, you need other sources of data. We will develop e-learning materials for use on disability measurement, and also arrange a South-South cooperation so that countries can learn from one another. Those with good practices can be teachers for those that want to learn about how things are done in those ones with good practices, and also provide advisory assistance upon the request of the countries. Next, please. I don't know, I guess it's not being shown. Oh yeah, it's there. This is a far-reaching project that UNSD cannot work on its own. We will work with other stakeholders within the UN family, including the Division for Social Policy and Development. We will work with other UN agencies, WHO, UNICEF, ILO, World Bank, UNESCO, and the regional commissions, and of course, the Washington group so that we can finalize the work that this group has carried out over the years and come up with UN recommendations for disability measurement. Next, please. I want to let you know that this is not the first time that the UN Statistics Division is working on the area of disability. We have a long history that spans almost 30 years in the past, whereby we've developed guidelines, including the principles and guidelines for development of disability statistics, including the principles and recommendations for population and housing censuses, and also data compilation and dissemination. It was actually as a result of analyzing the data in our database that we noticed a non-comparability of data and methods that the countries were used, that my office, actually I, was an organizer of an international seminar at which we recommended the formation of the Washington group. So in that context, I'm actually a founding member of the Washington group. We also provided technical assistance in the form of workshops. Next, please. In conclusion, I want to say that we have to get data that are fit for purpose through development of tools and guidelines, through national capacity development, and all this in close collaboration, particularly with the countries, with others of course, but particularly with the countries. After all, nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for letting us know what UN Statistics Division is doing to promote more disability statistics in the future. This is very useful work. And I'm now going to move to the next panelist, Mrs. Claudia Capa. She's a statistics and monitoring specialist at UNICEF and has been working for many years also on disability statistics, specifically in developing measures to identify children with disabilities in surveys. So Claudia, we are happy to hear from you in the next few minutes on how can this work help us to implement the 2030 agenda. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. I would like to start my intervention by thanking the organizer for giving UNICEF the opportunity to join this distinguished panel on this important day. I would like to share with you two main considerations in response to the theme of the day, so the building of a 2013 agenda that will be inclusive for all persons with disability from the data standpoint. The first point I would like to make is probably not a surprising one, given the fact that I'm here to represent UNICEF, and it's really the need for special consideration to children when trying to address the need for data on disability. Data on disability have been inadequate and much needed for all population groups, and Margaret and Linda before me have beautifully made the case for reliable and robust data on disability. But within the context of this need for data, I think children have been particularly invisible in data collection efforts. A systematic review that was conducted by UNICEF over the last couple of years showed that of the 700 and plus surveys and censuses that have been conducted in the last 15 years, only 22 of them, 22, specifically included measures that were designed to capture disability in children. And we know from research then, when children are not included in data collection with specific questions that are tailored to capture disability in children, they are not visible, they are not captured. In other words, children, when there are no specific questions aimed at collecting disability data on them, tend to be under-enumerated by using generic questionnaires applicable to the entire population. So when we think about ways in which we need to develop an inclusive data collection system on disability, we need to remember that children need to have specific data collection tools that reflect their developmental status. So children, by their definition, are in a constant process of development. From the data collection point, this creates some unique challenges. So, and we know now, after many, many years of data collection, that generic questions that are applicable to adults simply do not produce reliable results on children. So when we try to develop an inclusive data collection system, we have to keep children at the center of the agenda. And children from low economic background, and girls in particular, tend to be underestimated even more in data collection efforts that are not designed to specifically capture them. Surveys that have been implemented with specific questions for children have generated better results in terms of this ability of specifically address the need of children with disability. There was an important reference in the interventions by the panelists before me about the importance of censuses for generating systematic data on disability and household survey as a source of data that can provide you with additional information. Well, it is important, again, in the spirit of being inclusive, to remember that within the context of household surveys, specifically when we try to address the need of children with disability, we are not capturing the population of children who do not reside in households. And children with disability are very often found in institutions. So we do need to compensate the information that we get from household survey with other methods of data collection that will allow us to capture children who reside in institutions, and children in institutions, as we know, are very likely to have disability, and disability might be the reasons why they are placed in institutions. The second point I would like to make is about what can be done to support national efforts to address the need for disability data. And I'm glad that, again, I'm following the intervention from Margaret that so beautifully expressed the importance of responding to the needs of countries when thinking about creating this demand for disability data. As the international community, creating this demand for reliable and comprehensive data on disability is certainly important, but such demand comes with responsibility to provide support to countries in this effort to produce data on these important issues. What does this support imply? Well, it implies, in my view, two basic things that, again, were mentioned before. First, the need to provide countries with tested and validated data collection instruments that can be used in their national efforts to collect data. But the development of data collection instrument is not sufficient. Developing a questionnaire and making the questionnaire available to country is not enough, because country needs capacity and need resources to be able to take these tools and integrate them in their data collection efforts. So what does it mean, capacity? We mean that we need to do systematic investments in strengthening national capacity for the collection, analysis, interpretation, and also use of the disability statistics that are generated. Why? Because this remains a very complex area of measurement. And the new data needs that have been generated by the new SDGs agenda are such that countries need to have dedicated support in these efforts toward generating stronger evidence on disability. So at this point, it's obviously legitimate to ask what is UNICEF doing then to address such needs in response to the point that I myself made on the need to have specific tools for children and specific and systematic way to support countries in these data collection efforts. Well, UNICEF is working to strengthen child disability measurement by engaging in important partnerships, first and foremost. In response to the need for robust data collection tools, UNICEF and the Washington Group, with an important support from the Government of Australia, have worked together since 2011 on the development of a new data collection module on child functioning and disability for use in censuses and surveys. This module reflects current thinking on disability measures and is intended to produce internationally comparable data on disability. It covers children between the ages of 2 and 17 and assess functional limitations in the domain of speech, language, hearing, vision, learning, mobility, motor, emotions, plays, all domains of functioning that are of particular relevance and importance for children. UNICEF and the Washington Group, however, are also working on the development of a specific measure that aim at collecting information on school environment and participation. We know that disability is a complex concept that results from the interaction of individual characteristics with the environment. In response to one of the questions that Maria raised about the importance of measuring the environment and the specific reference to the SDG targets about accessibility, well, UNICEF and the Washington Group are developing this module that really look at the attitudes of parents and people in general vis-à-vis schooling for children with disability, but also try to measure the environment, the school environment. Children might be attending school, including children with disability, but the school setting and the environment in which they are learning might not be able to accommodate their learning needs. So through this type of new data collection instruments, we will also be able to identify possible barriers and facilitators to school participation for children with disability. Together, these two new modules will provide a comprehensive measurement of disability, assessing both individual characteristics as well as environmental factors. When used in surveys that cover indicators of well-being for children, like for instance DHS survey or a mixed survey that covers topics like immunization, birth registration, violence, these instruments will allow us to disaggregate very important well-being indicators for children, like stunting, for instance, or wasting, by disability status. And therefore, we will finally be able to report on major international commitments, including those resulting from the SDG agenda, by disability status. So there are no excuses anymore that can prevent us from disaggregating data, because we have now tested and validated instruments that will allow us to identify children with disability and therefore report on their well-being status. These modules are now undergoing the final round of testing and will be launched at the Statistical Commission next year, a side event, the one on child functioning and disability, and therefore after that will be made available for country to use. However, and this is my last point, I said it earlier, developing data collection instrument is not enough. This has to be linked to capacity assistance and also capacity building activities. To strengthen countries' capacities to generate and use disability data, UNICEF and the Washington Group are conducting national and regional workshops on the measurement of disability in children, again with a specific focus on children. The trainings target national statistical officers, government staff, disability DPOs, and local researchers on concept, models, measure of disabilities, survey design, data processing issues, how to disseminate the data, how to use the data to promote change for children with disability. We are very excited to see that these initiatives have generated overwhelming interest and enthusiasm. In 2015, UNICEF and the Washington Group have provided direct training or technical assistance to more than 30 low and middle income countries in their data collection efforts on child disability, and we plan to reach 50 more countries by the end of 2016 through this project that we have with support and funding from the Government of Australia. UNICEF is committed to continuing this fruitful collaboration with the Washington Group and the Australian Government for the development of harmonized data collection tools and production of internationally comparable statistics. We hope many statistical offices, DPOs, and other partners will join us in this important task. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Claudia, for this optimistic intervention, telling us that there is no more excuse not to have disability desegregation. I hope the members of the interagency and expert group on SDG indicators are hearing you at this point. So I'll also make, before I go to the next speaker, I'll make an announcement, because I know there are several people here in the room that are impatiently waiting for the UN Film Festival. We'll have 5 more speakers. I estimate this will take about 25 minutes, and after that we will start the UN Film Festival. So stay with us, it will happen. So we will continue now with the next speaker, Mrs. Alarco Cieza from WHO. Unfortunately, she could not join us in person, but we will have a video from her giving her intervention. She's the coordinator of the WHO's work on disability and rehabilitation, and among her tasks she also oversees the work of WHO on data collection, particularly the new model disability surveys. So I hope we can start the video now. Can we? Okay, so let's go for the video now.
Dear Chair, dear distinguished guests and colleagues, it is a great pleasure for WHO to be part of this panel discussion on this International Day of Persons with Disabilities. My colleagues from UNDESA have already concretized in the title of this panel discussion the essential components of operationalizing the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda from the perspective of disability. It is about disability data and statistics, indicators, and monitoring and evaluating development policies, programs, and actions. For WHO, the disability data and disability statistics need to be guided by the definition of disability we find in the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, as well as in the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. Disability is the outcome of the interaction of impairments and health conditions with the environment. Therefore, it is essential that our disability data include information about these 3 components. Disability in terms of how persons with impairments and health conditions live their lives and the problems they encounter. The level of health in terms of impairments and health conditions, and the physical, social, and political environment. Only if we have these 3 pieces of information, we will be able to have statistics that tell us what are the contribution of the environment and what are the contribution of our health to the experience of disability. Furthermore, only in this way we will be able to inform policy and development so that resources are invested where they are needed. In terms of indicators, the perspective of WHO is very clear. All indicators used to monitor the sustainable agenda, and all of those who are meaningful, those which report about people, should be ideally disaggregated for disability. This needs to be done, however, in such a way that persons with invisible disabilities, with mental disorders, with psychosocial disabilities, or musculoskeletal disorders, among others, are also taken into consideration when we disaggregate. In line with one of the topics of this International Day of Persons with Disabilities, we need to include persons with invisible disabilities in society, and to achieve this, it is necessary to include them in our statistics. Monitoring needs to be a collaborative effort of all UN agencies, statistical offices, civil society, and organizations of persons with disabilities. All of us need to contribute to this endeavor of monitoring the development agenda. Data needs to be shared and harmonized, and data collection efforts coordinated. UNDESA is taking a leading role on this endeavor, and WHO is extremely happy to closely collaborate with it. In line with WHO's quintessential task of collecting international comparable data, we are currently implementing the Model Disability Survey in different regions of the world. We will be happy to share this data with the international community with the purpose of monitoring inclusive development. Thank you.
So we'll now continue with the next speaker, Mrs. Julie Wicks from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She's here as a representative of the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. And as you have already heard from other panelists, this group has been working on international measures for disability, internationally comparable. So Julie, please tell us how can this work help us for the 2030 agenda?
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you so much for your warm welcome to the Washington Group on Disability Statistics to participate in today's celebration of persons with disabilities. I feel like the speakers, each preceding me, took a little bit of my talk and incorporated it into theirs, and most closely I can pretty much, you can follow Claudia along, and that really reflects how collaborative the development work of the Washington Group has been with others, and how much each of the individuals here represented today, as well as many of those that we've heard from today and those in the audience and others, really have a stake in the themes for today's celebration. It's an important day to recognize the progress made towards inclusion of persons with disability, and of course it's a good day to remind us that full inclusion and participation are not yet achieved, and to rededicate our efforts towards these important goals. I'm especially pleased in a format like today that there is a program that includes a panel dedicated to the important and vital role of data. There's no one here that does not, of course, agree that in order to include people, you have to count people. And we've heard a lot about invisible disabilities. Well, you know, mental, psychosocial, developmental disabilities, of course, are something that we initially consider when we hear the term invisible disabilities. But people with disabilities are all invisible, regardless of their disability, if we don't include measures and we don't count them. So, you know, I'm appreciative that what I've heard over and over again today is the resounding theme and importance of that. Of course, another theme that we've heard today is the importance of disaggregation. If once we count people, that gives us a very powerful tool to look at whether people with disabilities are being included or not. It's a very simple equation that I want to elaborate on a little bit so that I can get away from some of the things that my panelists have already discussed and shared with you. There are two necessary conditions in order to disaggregate data. First, the indicator must already be collected.
And in the SDGs, what we have are indicators that are already being collected. We have a multitude of indicators. I'll use education as an example later in my talk, but that is only one example. A second necessary condition is a straightforward and simple way to identify persons with disabilities so that the indicator can be disaggregated. The current SDGs framework addresses the first aforementioned condition, as the agreed set of indicators will be used for monitoring and evaluating progress in the implementation of its goals and targets. Equally important, though, is the second condition, which as you've heard today, is truly already met. There are no further excuses. 15 years ago, the UN Statistical Commission, as Margaret shared with us, established the Washington Group on Disability Statistics to really address the situation where we either had a complete dearth of measures of disability or there were very, very many measures, but the quality of those measures and the international comparability of the data that was obtained by those measures was not what we really needed in the statistical community. Since then, the Washington Group, with membership from over 100 national statistical offices, has developed a set of 6 short questions for use in censuses and surveys. They identify persons with disability for disaggregation purposes in internationally comparable settings. The approach taken by the Washington Group represents a break with methods used in the past. The questions reflect advances in the conceptualization of disability and use the World Health Organization's ICF as a framework. The focus is on functioning and basic actions in contrast to approaches that are based on a medical model focusing on impairments or bodily functions. The Washington Group, of course, in collaboration with UNICEF, has expanded those efforts. We've heard from Claudia about the module for children. Together, the question sets, besides being developed, were cognitively measured and tested. They've been tested in multiple countries, many, many countries, both cognitively and in the field. And consequently, the UN Statistical Division has recommended the use of the 6 sets, as we've already heard from another panelist, in the next round of population censuses. In 15 years, first of all, it's a lot of work, but you know, those are great strides. For the 2010 round of censuses, the recommendations did not include disability as a core topic, nor did it recommend a particular measure for identifying persons with disability in the items included in a census. In the recommendations published for the 2020 round, not only is disability now a core topic, just like gender, but the measure, a measure to really standardize the collection of information is finally being recommended. I think with those recommendations, I think we're really going to see some of those numbers for the many countries that include disability measures in their censuses and other data collections. We're going to see that also the number of countries that use similar measures and administer them the same way increase as well. So, you know, in terms of capacity, the use, the uptake of the standard use of those questions is quite an important endeavor. One that we are supporting, one that you've heard about some of the support here today, bilateral agencies including the UK Department for International Development and the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade have decided to use the questions for monitoring the effectiveness of their programs in reaching persons with disabilities. Overall, there is a broad international consensus that the Washington Group questions represent the international best practice for identifying persons with disabilities and for disaggregating data by disability. A couple of practical implications. These questions take approximately 1 minute to administer on a data collection. Besides testing them, we have timed them in multiple locations throughout the world. To produce a table with a given indicator disaggregated by disability takes equally little time. It's 1 line of code in most statistical programs. So, I'm capitalizing on Claudia's, comment that there are no excuses for countries to start collecting standardized data on disability, nor are there any excuses for the SDGs and those goals to be met, because discussing adding 1 or 2 paragraphs in the write-up on an indicator for the SDGs, indicators that have already been accepted, paragraphs that will already be written to describe the outcomes of those, also requires little time. And yet the sum of these small changes would significantly relate to approximately 15% of our population. That's 15% who would be invisible if we don't do these things, and we don't do them now. In conclusion, studying the exact nature of barriers for persons with disabilities, determining actions to be taken, and planning for their implementation does take extensive time and thought and commitment. However, disaggregation, specifically disaggregating the SDG indicators to determine if those gaps exist, is a necessary first step for casting the spotlight on a group of people who have consistently been shown to experience higher rates of poverty and exclusion. Thank you.